Chapter 4, Section 4 of Winds of Doctrine, Studies in Contemporary Opinion by George Santayana. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 4, The Philosophy of Mr. Bertrand Russell. Section 4, Hypostatic Ethics. If Mr. Russell, in his essay on the Elements of Ethics, had wished to propitiate the unregenerate naturalist before trying to convert him, he could not have chosen a more skilful procedure, for he begins by telling us that what is called good conduct is conduct which is a means to other things which are good on their own account, and hence the study of what is good or bad on its own account must be included in ethics. Two consequences are involved in this. First, that ethics is concerned with the economy of all values, and not with moral goods only, or with duty. And second, that values may and do inhere in a great variety of things and relations, all of which it is the part of wisdom to respect, and if possible to establish. In this matter, according to our author, the general philosopher is prone to one error, and the professed moralist to another. The philosopher, bent on the construction of a system, is inclined to simplify the facts unduly, and to twist them into a form in which they can all be deduced from one or two general principles. The moralist, on the other hand, being primarily concerned with conduct, tends to become absorbed in means, to value the actions men ought to perform more than the ends which such actions serve. Hence most of what they value in this world would have to be omitted by many moralists from any imagined heaven, because there such things as self-denial and effort and courage and pity could find no place. Kant has the bad eminence of combining both errors in the highest possible degree, since he holds that there is nothing good except the virtuous will, a view which simplifies the good as much as any philosopher could wish, and mistakes means for ends as completely as any moralist could enjoin. Those of us who are what Mr. Russell would call ethical sceptics will be delighted at this way of clearing the ground. It opens before us the prospect of a moral philosophy that should estimate the various values of things known and of things imaginable, showing what combinations of goods are possible in any one rational system, and, if fancy could stretch so far, what different rational systems would be possible in places and times remote enough from one another not to come into physical conflict. Such ethics, since it would express in reflection the dumb but actual interests of men, might have both influence and authority over them, two things which an alien and dogmatic ethics necessarily lacks. The joy of the ethical sceptic in Mr. Russell is destined, however, to be short-lived. Before proceeding to the expression of concrete ideals, he thinks it necessary to ask a preliminary and quite abstract question, to which his essay is chiefly devoted, namely, what is the right definition of the predicate good, which we hope to apply in the sequel to such a variety of things? And he answers at once: the predicate good is indefinable. This answer he shows to be unavoidable, and so evidently unavoidable that we might perhaps have been absolved from asking the question. For, as he says, the so‐called definitions of good, that it is pleasure, the desired, and so forth, are not definitions of the predicate good, but designations of the things to which this predicate is applied by different persons. Pleasure and its rivals are not synonyms for the abstract quality good, but names for classes of concrete facts that are supposed to possess that quality. From this correct, if somewhat trifling observation, however, Mr. Russell, like Mr. Moore before him, evokes a portentous dogma. Not being able to define good, he hypostasizes it. Good and bad, he says, are qualities which belong to objects independently of our opinions, just as much as round and square do. And when two people differ as to whether a thing is good, only one of them can be right, though it may be very hard to know which is right. We cannot maintain that for me a thing ought to exist on its own account, while for you it ought not. That would merely mean that one of us is mistaken, since in fact everything either ought to exist or ought not. Thus we are asked to believe that good attaches to things for no reason or cause, and according to no principles of distribution; that it must be found there by a sort of receptive exploration in each separate case; in other words, that it is an absolute, not a relative thing, a primary and not a secondary quality. That the quality good is indefinable is one assertion, and obvious; but that the presence of this quality is unconditioned is another, and astonishing. My logic, I am well aware, is not very accurate or subtle, and I wish Mr. Russell had not left it to me to discover the connection between these two propositions. Green is an indefinable predicate, and the specific quality of it can be given only in intuition. But it is a quality that things acquire under certain conditions, so much so that the same bit of grass at the same moment may have it from one point of view and not from another. Right and left are indefinable; the difference could not be explained without being invoked in the explanation. Yet everything that is to the right is not to the right on no condition, but obviously on the condition that some one is looking in a certain direction. And if some one else at the same time is looking in the opposite direction, what is truly to the right will be truly to the left also. If Mr. Russell thinks this is a contradiction, I understand why the universe does not please him. The contradiction would be real, undoubtedly, if we suggested that the idea of good was at any time, or in any relation, the idea of evil, or the intuition of right that of left, or the quality of green that of yellow. These disembodied essences are fixed by the intent that selects them, and in that ideal realm they can never have any relations except the dialectical ones implied in their nature, and these relations they must always retain. But the contradiction disappears when, instead of considering the qualities in themselves, we consider the things of which those qualities are aspects. For the qualities of things are not compacted by implication, but are conjoined irrationally by nature as she will. And the same thing may be, and is, at once yellow and green, to the left and to the right, good and evil, many and one, large and small; and whatever verbal paradox there may be in this way of speaking, for from the point of view of nature it is natural enough, had been thoroughly explained and talked out by the time of Plato, who complained that people should still raise a difficulty so trite and exploded. Footnote 8: Plato, Philebus, 14d. The dialectical element in this dialogue is evidently the basis of Mr. Russell's as of Mr. Moore's ethics, but they have not adopted the other elements in it, I mean the political and the theological. As to the political element, Plato everywhere conceives the good as the eligible in life, and refers it to human nature and to the pursuit of happiness; that happiness which Mr. Russell, in a rash moment, says is but a name which some people prefer to give to pleasure. Thus in the Philebus, 11d, the good looked for is declared to be some state and disposition of the soul which has the property of making all men happy; and later, 66d, the conclusion is that insight is better than pleasure as an element in human life. As to the theological element, Plato, in hypostasizing the good, does not hypostasize it as good, but as cause or power, which is, it seems to me, the sole category that justifies hypostasis, and logically involves it; for if things have a ground at all, that ground must exist before them and beyond them. Hence the whole Platonic and Christian scheme, in making the good independent of private will and opinion, by no means makes it independent of the direction of nature in general, and of human nature in particular; for all things have been created with an innate predisposition towards the creative good, and are capable of finding happiness in nothing else. Obligation, in this system, remains internal and vital. Plato attributes a single vital direction and a single moral source to the cosmos. This is what determines and narrows the scope of the true good; for the true good is that relevant to nature. Plato would not have been a dogmatic moralist had he not been a theist. Footnote 8. Indeed, while square is always square, and round round, a thing that is round may actually be square also, if we allow it to have a little body and to be a cylinder. But perhaps what suggests this hypostasis of good is rather the fact that what others find good, or what we ourselves have found good in moods with which we retain no sympathy, is sometimes pronounced by us to be bad; and far from inferring from this diversity of experience that the present good, like the others, corresponds to a particular attitude or interest of ours, and is dependent upon it, Mr. Russell and Mr. Moore infer instead that the presence of the good must be independent of all interests, attitudes, and opinions. They imagine that the truth of a proposition, attributing a certain relative quality to an object, contradicts the truth of another proposition, attributing to the same object an opposite relative quality. Thus, if a man here and another man at the Antipodes call opposite directions up, only one of them can be right, though it may be very hard to know which is right. To protect the belated innocence of this state of mind, Mr. Russell, so far as I can see, has only one argument and one analogy. The argument is, that if this were not the case, we could not reason with a man as to what is right. We do in fact hold that when one man approves of a certain act while another disapproves, one of them is mistaken, which would not be the case with a mere emotion. If one man likes oysters and another dislikes them, we do not say that either of them is mistaken. In other words, we are to maintain our prejudices, however absurd, lest it should become unnecessary to quarrel about them. Truly, the debating society has its idols, no less than the cave and the theatre. The analogy that comes to buttress somewhat this singular argument is the analogy between ethical propriety and physical or logical truth. An ethical proposition may be correct or incorrect, in a sense justifying argument, when it touches what is good as a means, that is, when it is not intrinsically ethical, but deals with causes and effects, or with matters of fact or necessity. But to speak of the truth of an ultimate good would be a false collocation of terms. An ultimate good is chosen, found, or aimed at; it is not opined. The ultimate intuitions on which ethics rests are not debatable, for they are not opinions we hazard, but preferences we feel, and it can be neither correct nor incorrect to feel them. We may assert these preferences fiercely or with sweet reasonableness, and we may be more or less incapable of sympathizing with the different preferences of others. About oysters we may be tolerant, like Mr. Russell, and about character intolerant; but that is already a great advance in enlightenment, since the majority of mankind have regarded as hateful in the highest degree any one who indulged in pork, or beans, or frogs' legs, or who had a weakness for anything called unnatural; for it is the things that offend their animal instincts that intense natures have always found to be, intrinsically and par excellence, abominations. I am not sure whether Mr. Russell thinks he has disposed of this view where he discusses the proposition that the good is the desired, and refutes it on the ground that it is commonly admitted that there are bad desires, and when people speak of bad desires they seem to mean desires for what is bad. Most people undoubtedly call desires bad when they are generically contrary to their own desires, and call objects that disgust them bad even when other people covet them. This human weakness is not, however, a very high authority for a logician to appeal to, being too like the attitude of the German lady who said that Englishmen called a certain object bread, and Frenchmen called it pain, but that it really was brot. Scholastic philosophy is inclined to this way of asserting itself. And Mr. Russell, though he candidly admits that there are ultimate differences of opinion about good and evil, would gladly minimize these differences, and thinks he triumphs when he feels that the prejudices of his readers will agree with his own. As if the constitutional unanimity of all human animals, supposing it existed, could tend to show that the good they agreed to recognize was independent of their constitution. In a somewhat worthier sense, however, we may admit that there are desires for what is bad, since desire and will, in the proper psychological sense of these words, are incidental phases of consciousness, expressing but not constituting those natural relations that make one thing good for another. At the same time, the words desire and will are often used in a mythical or transcendental sense, for those material dispositions and instincts by which vital and moral units are constituted. It is in reference to such constitutional interests that things are really good or bad, interests which may not be fairly represented by any incidental conscious desire. No doubt any desire, however capricious, represents some momentary and partial interest, which lends to its objects a certain real and inalienable value. Yet when we consider, as we do in human society, the interests of men, whom reflection and settled purposes have raised more or less to the ideal dignity of individuals, then passing fancies and passions may indeed have bad objects, and be bad themselves, in that they thwart the more comprehensive interests of the soul that entertains them. Food and poison are such only relatively, and in view of particular bodies, and the same material thing may be food and poison at once. The child, and even the doctor, may easily mistake one for the other. For the human system, whiskey is truly more intoxicating than coffee, and the contrary opinion would be an error. But what a strange way of vindicating this real though relative distinction, to insist that whiskey is more intoxicating in itself, without reference to any animal; that it is pervaded, as it were, by an inherent intoxication, and stands dead drunk in its bottle. Yet just in this way Mr. Russell and Mr. Moore conceive things to be dead good and dead bad. It is such a view, rather than the naturalistic one, that renders reasoning and self‐criticism impossible in morals. For wrong desires, and false opinions as to value, are conceivable only because a point of reference or criterion is available to prove them such. If no point of reference and no criterion were admitted to be relevant, nothing but physical stress could give to one assertion of value greater force than to another. The shouting moralist no doubt has his place, but not in philosophy. That good is not an intrinsic or primary quality, but relative and adventitious, is clearly betrayed by Mr. Russell's own way of arguing, whenever he approaches some concrete ethical question. For instance, to show that the good is not pleasure, he can avowedly do nothing but appeal to ethical judgments with which almost every one would agree. He repeats in effect Plato's argument about the life of the oyster, having pleasure with no knowledge. Imagine such mindless pleasure, as intense and prolonged as you please, and would you choose it? Is it your good? Here the British reader, like the blushing Greek youth, is expected to answer instinctively no. It is an argumentum ad hominem, and there can be no other kind of argument in ethics, but the man who gives the required answer does so not because the answer is self‐evident, which it is not, but because he is the required sort of man. He is shocked at the idea of resembling an oyster. Yet changeless pleasure, without memory or reflection, without the wearisome intermixture of arbitrary images, is just what the mystic, the voluptuary, and perhaps the oyster find to be good. Ideas, in their origin, are probably signals of alarm, and the distress which they marked in the beginning always clings to them in some measure, and causes many a soul, far more profound than that of the young Protarchus or of the British reader, to long for them to cease altogether. Such a radical hedonism is indeed inhuman; it undermines all conventional ambitions, and is not a possible foundation for political or artistic life. But that is all we can say against it. Our humanity cannot annul the incommensurable sorts of good that may be pursued in the world, though it cannot itself pursue them. The impossibility which people labor under of being satisfied with pure pleasure as a goal is due to their want of imagination, or rather to their being dominated by an imagination which is exclusively human. The author's estrangement from reality reappears in his treatment of egoism, and most of all in his free man's religion. Egoism, he thinks, is untenable, because if I am right in thinking that my good is the only good, then every one else is mistaken unless he admits that my good, not his, is the only good. Most people would admit that it is better two people's desires should be satisfied than only one person's. Then what is good is not good for me or for you, but is simply good. It is indeed so evident that it is better to secure a greater good for A than a lesser good for B, that it is hard to find any still more evident principle by which to prove this. And if A happens to be someone else, and B to be myself, that cannot affect the question, since it is irrelevant to the general question who A and B may be. To the question, as the logician states it after transforming men into letters, it is certainly irrelevant, but it is not irrelevant to the case as it arises in nature. If two goods are somehow rightly pronounced to be equally good, no circumstance can render one better than the other. And if the locus in which the good is to arise is somehow pronounced to be indifferent, it will certainly be indifferent whether that good arises in me or in you. But how shall these two pronouncements be made? In practice, values cannot be compared save as represented or enacted in the private imagination of somebody. For we could not conceive that an alien good was a good, as Mr. Russell cannot conceive that the life of an ecstatic oyster is a good, unless we could sympathize with it in some way in our own persons, and on the warmth which we felt in so representing the alien good would hang our conviction that it was truly valuable, and had worth in comparison with our own good. The voice of reason bidding us prefer the greater good, no matter who is to enjoy it, is also nothing but the force of sympathy, bringing a remote existence before us vividly sub specie boni. Capacity for such sympathy measures the capacity to recognize duty, and therefore, in a moral sense, to have it. Doubtless it is conceivable that all wills should become cooperative, and that nature should be ruled magically by an exact and universal sympathy. But this situation must be actually attained in part, before it can be conceived or judged to be an authoritative ideal. The tigers cannot regard it as such, for it would suppress the tragic good called ferocity, which makes in their eyes the chief glory of the universe. Therefore the inertia of nature, the ferocity of beasts, the optimism of mystics, and the selfishness of men and nations must all be accepted as conditions for the peculiar goods, essentially incommensurable, which they can generate severally. It is misplaced vehemence to call them intrinsically detestable, because they do not, as they cannot, generate or recognize the goods we prize. In the real world persons are not abstract egos like A and B, so that to benefit one is clearly as good as to benefit another. Indeed, abstract egos could not be benefited, for they could not be modified at all, even if somehow they could be distinguished. It would be the qualities or objects distributed among them that would carry, wherever they went, each its inalienable cargo of value, like ships sailing from sea to sea. But it is quite vain and artificial to imagine different goods charged with such absolute and comparable weights. An actual egoism is not the thin and refutable thing that Mr. Russell makes of it. What really holds is that a given man, oneself, and those akin to him, are qualitatively better than other beings; that the things they prize are intrinsically better than the things prized by others; and that therefore there is no injustice in treating these chosen interests as supreme. The injustice, it is felt, would lie rather in not treating things so unequally. This feeling may, in many cases, amuse the impartial observer or make him indignant; yet it may, in every case, according to Mr. Russell, be absolutely just. The refutation he gives of egoism would not dissuade any fanatic from exterminating all his enemies with a good conscience. It would merely encourage him to assert that what he was ruthlessly establishing was the absolute good. Doubtless such conscientious tyrants would be wretched themselves, and compelled to make sacrifices which would cost them dear; but that would only extend, as it were, the pernicious egoism of that part of their being which they had allowed to usurp a universal empire. The twang of intolerance and of self mutilation is not absent from the ethics of Mr. Russell and Mr. Moore, even as it stands; and one trembles to think what it may become in the mouths of their disciples. Intolerance itself is a form of egoism, and to condemn egoism intolerantly is to share it. I cannot help thinking that a consciousness of the relativity of values, if it became prevalent, would tend to render people more truly social than would a belief that things have intrinsic and unchangeable values, no matter what the attitude of any one to them may be. If we said that goods, including the right distribution of goods, are relative to specific natures, moral warfare would continue, but not with poisoned arrows. Our private sense of justice itself would be acknowledged to have but a relative authority, and while we could not have a higher duty than to follow it, we should seek to meet those whose aims were incompatible with it as we meet things physically inconvenient, without insulting them as if they were morally vile or logically contemptible. Real unselfishness consists in sharing the interests of others. Beyond the pale of actual unanimity, the only possible unselfishness is chivalry, a recognition of the inward right and justification of our enemies fighting against us. This chivalry has long been practiced in the battlefield without abolishing the causes of war, and it might conceivably be extended to all the conflicts of men with one another, and of the warring elements within each breast. Policy, hypnotization, and even surgery may be practiced without exorcisms or anathemas. When a man has decided on a course of action, it is a vain indulgence in expletives to declare that he is sure that course is absolutely right. His moral dogma expresses its natural origin all the more clearly the more hotly it is proclaimed; and ethical absolutism, being a mental grimace of passion, refutes what it says by what it is. Sweeter and more profound, to my sense, is the philosophy of Homer, whose every line seems to breathe the conviction that what is beautiful or precious has not thereby any right to existence. Nothing has such a right; nor is it given us to condemn absolutely any force, God or man, that destroys what is beautiful or precious, for it has doubtless something beautiful or precious of its own to achieve. The consequences of a hypostasis of the good are no less interesting than its causes. If the good were independent of nature, it might still be conceived as relevant to nature by being its creator or mover. But Mr. Russell is not a theist after the manner of Socrates. His good is not a power; nor would representing it to be such long help his case, for an ideal hypostasized into a cause achieves only a mythical independence. The least criticism discloses that it is natural laws, zoological species, and human ideals that have been projected into the empyrean; and it is no marvel that the good should attract the world where the good by definition is whatever the world is aiming at. The hypostasis accomplished by Mr. Russell is more serious and therefore more paradoxical. If I understand it, it may be expressed as follows: In the realm of eternal essences, before anything exists, there are certain essences that have this remarkable property, that they ought to exist, or at least that, if anything exists, it ought to conform to them. What exists, however, is deaf to this moral emphasis in the eternal. Nature exists for no reason; and indeed, why should she have subordinated her own arbitrariness to a good that is no less arbitrary? This good, however, is somehow good notwithstanding, so that there is an abysmal wrong in its not being obeyed. The world is, in principle, totally depraved; but as the good is not a power, there is no one to redeem the world. The saints are those who, imitating the impotent dogmatism on high, and despising their sinful natural propensities, keep asserting that certain things are in themselves good and others bad, and declaring to be detestable any other saint who dogmatizes differently. In this system the Calvinistic God has lost his creative and punitive functions, but continues to decree groundlessly what is good and what evil, and to love the one and hate the other with an infinite love or hatred. Meanwhile the reprobate need not fear hell in the next world, but the elect are sure to find it here. What shall we say of this strangely unreal and strangely personal religion? Is it a ghost of Calvinism, returned with none of its old force, but with its old aspect of rigidity? Perhaps. But then, in losing its force, in abandoning its myths and threats and rhetoric, this religion has lost its deceptive sanctimony and hypocrisy, and in retaining its rigidity it has kept what made it noble and pathetic. For it is a clear dramatic expression of that human spirit in this case a most pure and heroic spirit, which it strives so hard to dethrone. After all, the hypostasis of the good is only an unfortunate incident in a great accomplishment, which is the discernment of the good. I have dwelt chiefly on this incident, because in academic circles it is the abuses incidental to true philosophy that create controversy and form schools. Artificial systems, even when they prevail, after a while fatigue their adherents without ever having convinced or refuted their opponents, and they fade out of existence not by being refuted in their turn, but simply by a tacit agreement to ignore their claims, so that the true insight they were based on is too often buried under them. The hypostasis of philosophical terms is an abuse incidental to the forthright, unchecked use of the intellect. It substitutes for things the limits and distinctions that divide them. So physics is corrupted by logic, but the logic that corrupts physics is perhaps correct, and when it is moral dialectic it is more important than physics itself. Mr. Russell's ethics is ethics. When we mortals have once assumed the moral attitude, it is certain that an indefinable value accrues to some things as opposed to others, that these things are many, that combinations of them have values not belonging to their parts, and that these valuable things are far more specific than abstract pleasure, and far more diffuse than one's personal life. What a pity if this pure morality, in detaching itself impetuously from the earth, whose bright satellite it might be, should fly into the abyss at a tangent, and leave us as much in the dark as before. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.